We are now recording, and I'm now going to share my screen very briefly. Can you all see the STA harassment and bullying policy on your screen?
I do not see it.
Let's see.
Although
that's all right. Let's see. Share.
Let's get the link.
Can you see it now?
Oh, there we go.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, there it goes.
So the SCA prohibits harassment and bullying of all individuals and groups. Participants engaging in this behavior are subject to appropriate sanctions. If you're subjected to harassment, bullying, or retaliation, or if you become aware of anyone being harassed or bullied, contact the Seneschal, president of the SCA, or your kingdom's board ombudsman. And so I'm going to stop sharing. And without further ado, I turn it over to our instructor for the evening, Master Grimm.
Hello. All right. So this is a class in basically appreciating and writing Norse poetry. Poetry, I should say, in the Norse style. This is a common style used, I would say, probably from about the 7th or 8th century onward. Most of what I know is from around the 10th or 11th century. But it was continued to use after that to some limited degree, although it started getting out of fashion for in favor of more European styles. I'm going to, yep, there it is. I'm going to add the link for the handout for anybody who hadn't. I did add that to the meeting announcement. And if people like, I will share my screen and bring that up on it because I do have that available. But otherwise, I'm just going to talk. All right. So when we're talking about the Norse poetry, the poetry during the Viking era, there are two distinct categories. They're really kind of usages of it. This is a little bit of a false distinction, but it is a distinction that works. Oh, by the way, if anybody has any questions, just pipe up. I may or may not see your hand if you raise it, because I'm going to be going off of my handout. So just speak up if you like. All right. So anyway, so these two usages, what we call is usually referred to as Eddic poetry and Skaldic poetry. Now, most of the surviving poems come to us through really two main sources. The Poetic Edda, which is a collection of poems that were written probably up to around the 11th century, maybe a little bit later, and the sagas. The other source for a lot of these for some of these poems, although it's mostly excerpts, is a book called Edda, which was written by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, I think. I don't have it written down right in front of me, but it'll come up later, I'm sure. All right, so as for these distinctions, Eddic poetry is usually impersonal. It's always impersonal. It's written in a very impersonal style and preserved that way. Almost all examples of what we would call Eddic poetry are anonymous. There are some limited exceptions, which is one of the reasons why I think it's something of a false distinction. And it's also very monologue or dialogue heavy. A lot of times somebody is speaking in a poem, and this is true of much of Norse poetry. There are definitely examples of third-person narration, but it's a lot less common. For the most part, the Eddic poems are various stories from myth and legend. Some of them were clearly used to preserve theological or poetic information within the framework of the story. And so the story was created to give this information out there. A good example of that is a poem called Alvismal, which is where Thor is quizzing this an elf, dwarf really, who claims that he was promised Thor's daughter's hand in marriage. Thor asks him of the names of the sun, of the names of the wind, and in all of the languages of the earth. And Alvis replies, because he is very wise. These replies are probably not the names of the sun in various languages of the earth. He just calls them by various things. They're probably kennings. So this poem was created to preserve kennings and heity, which I'm going to get into in a short metaphors. So it goes through all the metaphors for sun, it goes through all the metaphors for wind, all the metaphors for rain. There are a few Etic praise poems which favor dialogue and create a situation where the virtues of the person who's being praised are being spoken about by various characters. There's one for Eric Bloodaxe, where a raven and a Valkyrie meet on a battlefield, and they're saying, "Wow, this is a lot of very good slaughter. Who created this? Oh, this was Eric Bloodaxe," and so on and so forth. And that they talk about his great virtues. So, skaldic poetry is attributed to a particular poet, usually composed for a specific reason or for a person. The skald is directly speaking to the listener. Now, most skaldic poems are either praise poems or something called låsavisor, which means occasional verse. That is to say, a verse that is made for a specific occasion. Frequently, this is a verse that was written for the skald to make his point on something. Egil, shall we go raid this town in front of us? And Egil replies in verse something about how glory is only won through combat and by being daring. Sometimes other stories are told in tribute to a gift. There's an example of a skald being given a beautiful shield depicting 3 stories, and he would basically speak of these stories in skaldic verse. Or sometimes there's another one where a skald is describing a beautiful house, which is also carved with stories, so he tells these stories in that verse. So skaldic poems make much more extensive use of metaphorical language. I'll use that word instead of kennings for now, and other more complex poetic devices. Some surviving poems are very obscure, almost like a word game. Much of what we know about skaldic poetry was preserved in a work entitled Edda by the 13th century poet and politician Snorri Sturluson. That's what I referred to a moment ago. Essentially, my understanding and my impression was Edda was essentially Snorri's way of preserving the rules of poetry so they wouldn't get lost. He thought that there was a real danger of Old Norse poetry getting never mind. Old Norse poetry getting eclipsed by the Latin-based forms, such as used by Saxo Grammaticus, and so he wrote an instruction manual. And thank heaven for him, because if he didn't write that instruction manual, we would have so little information on this. So anyway, to the building blocks. Alliteration. All Norse poetry depends on alliteration. Alliteration is the main poetic device of Norse poetry. There are others, but alliteration is the underlying theme. Alliteration is to poetry. Norse poetry is rhyme is to romantic poetry. So alliteration, what I mean by alliteration is the same initial vowel or consonant sound at the beginning of a word. So I give some examples on my handout: brave brother, fierce fire, hot hate, silver singer, asked and answered. So in the rules for Norse poetry, all vowels are considered to alliterate with any other vowel. You'd think this would make it easier, but not a lot of words start with vowels. So it actually works quite well that this rule exists. And it does kind of create a sound with the alliteration, that all vowels alliterate with each other. Now, Y, even if you're using as a Y sound, is still considered a vowel. This also is the equivalent of the Norse J, which is pronounced Y. So my examples here: evil age, Odin's only eye, over ice, easy year, or angry jarl. So consonant pairs, with the exception of S, only look to the first letter for alliteration. So broad beam, pleasing prayer, towering tree, all are considered to be fine examples of alliteration. The exception to that is unvoiced consonant pairs. So when both consonants are unvoiced, it does count as its own thing. In English and in Old Norse, that's really just ST, SK, and SP. That's it. TS in English is another consonant pair, but you never see that at the beginning of a syllable. It's only at the end. And I'm assuming that's the same in Old Norse too. You never see that doesn't exist in Old Norse's initial consonant sound. So my examples here: strong staves, spent spinning, skilled skald, or soft sleep. So an S with nothing else alliterates with any other S, but the ST, SK, and SP only alliterate with themselves. So one thing that's important, and I don't think I stressed this yet. No, I did not. Remember that the stress is always on a syllable, that is emphasized, that has stress. In Old Norse, this is always the first syllable of a word, but English, it frequently isn't. Behold, for example, it alliterates with H, not B, because the emphasis is on hold, not behold, not B. You always want to alliterate with the stress syllable, and you always want to alliterate with your ear, not with your eye, because English is inconsistent. Also, certain letter pairs like TH, CH, and SH sometimes have different sounds. These sounds don't exist in Old Norse. So when you're writing them in English, that's up to you. My opinion is I would treat them much the same way as I would treat ST, SK, and SP. They're their own thing. Sh does not really alliterate with K. Sh doesn't alliterate with S. And TH does exist in Old Norse. It only alliterates with itself. So certainly slain is my example here. That's an S sound at the beginning of the word that starts with C. Crushed keep, fearsome phrase, one will, sure sharp. Okay, now stress. I was talking about how a word is stressed. There's also a set pattern of stresses. Middle and modern English poetry tends to fall into an iambic pattern. There's some debate on how Old Norse poetry is stressed. Some people think it's very significant. Some people don't think it's significant at all. But it's clear that it does not need to fall into a constant pattern. If you look at any Norse poetry in the original language, it definitely follows a very dynamic pattern. Is this necessary? I'm not sure. I haven't done as much research in that as myself. I've heard people say yes. I've heard people say no. So all Norse meters use half lines in some way. You can consider them full lines. I like to think of them as half lines. Some authors consider them full lines. The most common Etic form is a half line composed of 4 beats, 2 stressed and 2 unstressed beats. Stress beats are always syntactically important, and that's actually a big thing and probably should deserve its own header. I may revise this at some point. Whatever you are stressing in the line is a syntactically important word. It's important to the meaning of the line. You don't stress of, you don't stress the, you don't stress an. I will give many examples when I get to the meter forms. So the standard Norse line does consist of the standard line, and there are many variations of this, but I want to go into the standard first, is 4 beats, 2 unstressed, 2 stressed, unstressed. Now for Etic meters, and this carries through in Anglo-Saxon as well, and this carries through up to Middle English, unstressed beats may be more than 1 syllable. There may or may not be rules for this. I'm not clear on that. Stress beats are always 1 syllable unless there's something called resolved. Resolved is a concept that does not translate well into English, but I want to go over it because Snorri goes over it. And when the period person goes over it in his instruction manual, you go over it. So Old Norse is composed of long and short vowels. By Old Norse rules, a short vowel cannot bear stress unless it becomes a long syllable by having enough consonants behind it, in front of it and behind it. What that translates to in English is a little harder to do, but bear in mind that some words may or may not be two syllables, or probably more like a heavy one. That's how I tend to use it. So a linguist by the name of Edward Sievers outlined the various rhythms that are below. Some scholars disagree with his findings. Here, see previous note about the significance of the stresses. I like these patterns. I think these patterns are somewhat important. I may revisit this in the future. Depends on what other scholars. More research is required, but there are essentially five different Sievers types. The stress is indicated with a slash. An unstressed beat is indicated with an X. So we've got the first line is what we would call, if we were talking in regarding English poetry, trochaic. Stress, unstress, stress, unstress. Send them words swiftly. The second type is iambic, a weapon when tried. The third, you have the two stresses at either. That's written wrong. Is that? No, it's not. Okay, no. That has the two stresses at either in the middle, so it kind of forms a peak. His hair bristled. The third and fourth are basically variations on the theme where you have the first two stresses at the beginning of the line. When this happens, there's Edward Sievers' thought, and it certainly sounds reasonable, that there's a secondary stress indicated by this little grave mark. So this may too, or sharp spears we hurled. So we have the two stresses and then a little bit lesser stress. And the final form is where you have the stresses at the end. Fierce is this fire. So the main upshot of that is that you tend to have patterns where you can form your line into four distinct elements, even if you have extra syllables. Your stress beat, unstressed beat, stress beat, unstressed beat, or stress beat, unstressed syllables, stress syllable. This is actually a really useful concept because in there are some links between this and Middle English poetry. And Middle English poetry, they actually stretch things out a lot longer. So this is the last part of the building blocks. We're making pretty good time, actually. So I'm going to go over metaphors, what in Old Norse are referred to as kennings. So there are two basic types. And this, again, comes straight from Snorri. So it's right from the guy who wrote the manual. They're called aheti and kennings. Aheti is a fairly simple descriptive word for a thing. So you're basically describing an object or person or thing based on attributes it has, using it as a sort of a poetic metaphor. So a battle could be referred to as clamor, night can be referred to as lightless, the sky is an arch, and the sun is all bright. All these things are pretty obvious. Kennings, they are sometimes obvious, but they get a little bit more phrase-based. It's always more than one word that is talking about the thing by its attributes rather than by what it is. Snorri lists three types: simple, double, and extended. A simple kenning has just one element, and I'm going into this as building blocks, basically. So, for example, we can call gold as arm fire. I wish I could reach it, but well, here we are. So you would wear your gold on your arm. This is more silver looking, but you'd wear your gold on your arm, so therefore it could be arm fire because it gleams on your arm. A battle is a spear clash. Blood is sword dew. It is the liquid that drips from the sword. A ship is a wave steed. A sword is battle fire, again gleaming in the battle. A shield could be the wall of the ship, because if you think of your Viking ships, you have the shields along the wall. This is an honest to God kenning that is taken from some poems. The ship's wall or wall of the ship, and these are interchangeable, by the way. So you could say arm fire or fire of the arm, or clash of spears or spear clash, dew of the sword, sword dew. In Old Norse, they're used either way. Ocean is the ship's land, just as a person goes over land or a horse goes over land, the ship goes over the ocean. And a king could be a gold giver, because generosity is considered one of the most important virtues in Norse society. A double kenning adds a heity or simple kenning to that single element. So we're starting to get a little complicated here. So if I refer to the all-bright of the arm, all-bright is sun, sun of the arm, or gleaming thing on the arm is gold. Sword could be the fire of the spear clash. Spear clash is battle, fire of battle is a sword. A shield could be the wall of the wave steed. A wave steed is a ship. It's a horse that goes over the waves. A wall of the ship is a shield. You always just break it down. And an extended kenning starts getting to be this fun sort of word game that the skalds like to play sometimes. And the more complicated poems are like this. So a holder of the wall of the wave steed would be a warrior, because a holder of a shield, wall of the wave steed is the shield, as I just said, and a holder of a shield is a warrior. Giver of the all-bright of the arm could be a king, because he's giving gold. All bright of the arm. Dew of the fire of the spear clash would be blood. Spear clash is battle, fire of the spear clash is sword, dew of the sword, blood. So there are a few standard rules that apply across kennings. A common one is that any name for a god any name of any god will stand for a man, and any name of a goddess for a woman. These are obviously frequently done to get that all-important alliteration. So you could call, and this is actually straight from a poem, a Goldring Girth. Girth is the name of one of the Valkyries. So Goldring, woman. Speartur, warrior, for a spearman. Odin of the ship, sailor, could be a sailor or a captain. Bear in mind that you're not necessarily using the god in an appropriate way, particularly if you're being flattering, but just because Odin is the king of the gods, you're not necessarily only using him for somebody who's a king or a leader or a chieftain. The thing I will add to that is also Odin has a ton of names. So you can make anything alliterate with Odin practically, because if you look at one of the poems, Grim the Smile, he literally lists like a good 24 names that he's gone by. So there you go. So in general, Eddic poetry generally only uses very simple kennings, sometimes none at all. Sometimes it uses heity. Double or extended kennings are very rare. There's one exception that I can think of. Skaldic poetry frequently gets very, very complex. There's a poem about Thor that is just ridiculous in places. Allegory is a name that Snorri uses to indicate that using the same kenning throughout the poem. It is definitely more common in Skaldic than Eddic poetry. So if one refers to men as trees, then you would also refer to arms as branches and an army as a forest. If one is cut, one could be cut down or killed. I will add to this, particularly since we're only at the halfway point, or a little bit less, considering we started a little late. A very common way of referring to kennings is to refer to a story. So, or something by somebody else. So you might actually refer to Odin as the cargo of Frigg's arms. So that is to say, Frigg embraces Odin. She's his wife. That Odin is the cargo of her arms, what is held within her arms. You also might refer to a story as a kenning. Snorri lists a whole bunch of these, some of which are really, really interesting stories. By way of example, there was a king named Hrolv who was on the run from another king by the name of Evil's, and Evil's army. And so to slow down his pursuit, Hrolv scattered gold out behind him so that the army that was pursuing him stopped to pick up the gold. So gold is sometimes referred to as Kroki's grain, or seeds of the Fjords plains, because that's where this story took place, or Kroki's bright barley. All of these things are used as kennings for gold, referring directly to this story. In the SCA, we can also refer to stories or to attributes. I know when writing my own poems, I've used leaf crowned as a laurel, or pricked breast as a pelican, white belted as a knight, or spur, the spurred someone with spurs. So that is a very common way of referring to things. All right, well, that's about the midpoint. Are there any questions?
I have a question, actually.
Okay.
To pull back to the meters. If someone starts a poem in 1 meter, is that, pattern of stress and unstressed consistent throughout, or would they interchange the different pattern of 2 stressed, 2 unstressed throughout a single poem?
The pattern is, if we're talking about a pattern like iambic or trochaic, no, it's not consistent throughout the poem. It almost never is. As a full disclaimer, I learned a lot of the basics of this from my grand laurel, Fiona of Clare, who has her laurel in Old English poetry. And Old English poetry is from the same root, and therefore has a lot of commonalities with this. I'm going to go into that when I go into the first meter, then I'm going to go into the first meter style. She believes that you actually have to vary your stress pattern between the 2 half lines of the same line. So she's of the belief, and there are definitely people who agree with her, that you always make it dynamic when you're writing it. I'm not so sure, and I'm not so sure this is the case for Old Norse. And I've known people who have dismissed Edward Sievers's patterns completely. They don't believe that they're actually. So there's definitely some debate there, but I would definitely say that you don't have to keep the same rhythm, and it's probably better if you vary it.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions on what we got so far? All right, then. I will go into the actual form. It's a little creepy to look at everybody muted. I'm going to say that right now, but you don't have to unmute yourselves, but it's a little creepy. So the first form that these poems... So Old Norse has a number of distinct styles of poetry. Snorri does go into these. He doesn't really describe how to write them very well, unfortunately, so we've had to extrapolate a lot of it, other than Drokveit, which is the last thing I'm going to get into. He doesn't go into the instructions on those specific forms as well. It's moderately distinct from Old English poetry, where it always tends to follow the same form, although I believe there are some variations on that. Old Norse really does fall into some honest to goodness metric forms. Think of them the same way you might think of, say, a sonnet or a ballad or a ballad meter, or things like that. So anyway, the first form is called Fornøyrislag. By the way, I'm going to use reconstructed Old Norse pronunciation, medieval Icelandic, really, pronunciation for these. And so it's a little bit different from modern Icelandic, if you're familiar with that. So anyway, Fornyrðislag is the most common Eddic poetry form. It's almost certainly the oldest. It's got to be. It's based on something older in German and is from that same common root as Old English poetry. Most of the poems, about 3/4 of the Poetic Edda, are in this meter. We also see it used in skaldic poetry as well, particularly for Lossavísur, where those occasional poems. And I'm actually do have an example here. Yep, I have an example here in both English and Old Norse. It is very similar to Old English poetry. In general, the difference between Old English poetry and Fornyrðislag is usage. Old English poetry allows run-on sentences. Old Norse is always end-stopped, in this form anyway. That is to say, each line forms at least a complete thought. I've heard some writers describe it as have a pause of at least a comma in weight. Each line is divided into 2 half lines that I went over before. As I said before, some authors like splitting them up into lines. Because it is end-stopped, I prefer to think of them as half lines. Each half line is 2 stressed and 2 unstressed beats. 4 to 5 syllables is very typical of this form. It sometimes gets a little bit longer in the unstressed syllables, but usually it's about 4 to 5 syllables. It uses the common stress patterns, the Sievers types that I went into. So the alliteration rule, and this is the alliteration rule that carries very, very much through a lot of the other forms and into the skaldic poetry, is that the first stress beat of the second half line, so the third stress beat in the line, alliterates with the first, second, or both stress beats in the first half line. So, and Snorri refers to this as, so the first stress beat in the second half line is the main staff. He calls it the hovustavr, which means main staff. And that alliterates with 1 or 2 studlar, or props, in the first half line. So the fourth stress syllable, the last stress syllable, does not alliterate. Sometimes the other 3 do, sometimes not only 2 of them do, but it's always one in the, it always that third in the second half line, and one or both of the 2 in the first half line. Fourth line stanzas are typical, but not exclusive. So I have 2 examples right here in Fornyrðislag and straight Fornyrðislag, into Leothatcher in a moment. We wind the web of spears as young war king has waged before. Forth we shall fare where fray lies thick, and friend and foe fix sword against sword. So wind, web, young war king waged, so we only have 1 that time. Forth shall we fare, or we shall fare, where fray lies thick, F, and then friend and foe fix sword against sword. F is actually a very easy thing to alliterate in English. In Old Norse, actually, I happen to know this one. Vindum, vev, darradar, fan ungur konungur, 84. So ungur 80. Fram ganga oki folkvara, fram folk, vinner varjer vopnum skipta, vinner varjer vopnum. So, yeah. Harold, this is the second example is an example of what we call a Lossavísur, a poem that was written on the spot. Harold Sigurdsson, also called Harada, was about to face a much larger force of men without his armor. Forward we stride to fight bravely, our chests bared against the blue steel swords. Their helmets shine, I have not mine. Below in the ships lie our armor. So he actually threw in a little bit of rhyme there, and I actually do have the Old Norse right next to it. Framgonium ver I fyrkingu. So again, we have that FF alliteration. Brunula sir under blaregjar. The BB. Hjalmar skina Hefgarigmina. So that rhyme is actually still there in the Old Norse, and it's within the line. Nu ligskrudvort av skipum nidri. And then we have an SK alliteration. Interestingly enough, by the way, after he spoke that poem, he said, "No, that is too poorly composed. Let me speak another." And then he spoke something in Brokvet, which is a much more complex form, which I will get into last. So that does lead me to think that while the Skalds did sometimes write in Fornurðarslag, they considered Brokvet to be the one true form, so to speak. So there is a variant. It's called Leothatcher, which uses longer half lines with more unstressed syllables. 5 to 7 is typical. It is pretty rare. There are some Leothatcher stanzas in the Havamal. There's some Leothatcher stanzas in a few other poems that I can think of. I think there's at least a couple in Grimni Small. There's only one poem, period, that we have that uses it as a sold meter, which is called the Greenlandish Lay of Atli. The example I give from Leothatcher is from Havamal. At eve, praise the day when ashes of fire, maidens at wedlock, a weapon when tried, ice when it is crossed, to ale that is drunk. And here we see some of those vowel alliterations, eve and ashes, ice and ale. Despite the fact that they're not the same letter, it still alliterates. And then we have wedlock and weapon. All right, that is the basic form. If you really break everything else down, everything else is based on that. It's a more complicated version of that. And that form is also, as I said, nearly identical to Old English poetry. Old English poetry uses the kennings differently and potentially has run-on sentences. But otherwise, it's almost exactly the same. So the second form is called Leothatcher. It is, which translates to the meter of chance. It is the other dominant meter of the Poetic Edda. About a third of the poems are in this form. It is made up of paired lines, odds and even. So, and again, some people say 3 lines rather than I say odd and even lines, some people divide it into 3 lines, but I'll get into that in a moment. So the odd lines are almost exactly the same as Fornurðarslag. They're the 4 to 5 syllables, each half line, and the alliteration is on the main staff, the third syllable, stress syllable, or the first syllable of the second half line, and it alliterates with one or both of the stress syllables of the first half line. That's the even line, the odd line. So your first line is going to look like that. Your second line is called a full line or a long line. It has no set length. It has 2 to 3 stress syllables with 2 alliteration. With 2 of those, I'm sorry. 2 to 3 stress syllables, 2 of which alliterate. The full lines don't follow common patterns, but generally end in a stress. I remember reading somebody once said that they can't end in a trochee, so an stress on stress. I'm not sure of that. I think I have seen that, so I don't know. So the line pair completes a single thought with the full line supplementing or finishing the material in the half line. So again, rather than being end stopped at the end of the line, it's end stopped at the end of the line pair. Now, this is kind of important because this form was only ever used for what they call gnomic poetry. It's always somebody is speaking. Either a person is speaking, for example, the poem where Frey falls in love with a Jotun woman and woos her is in this format. He's speaking, his servant Skirner is speaking, the woman is speaking. Is frequently used to preserve information. Repetition is common, particularly in questions. The 4-line stanzas are typical, but not universal. So you usually have 2 of these pairs in each line. There is a variant called Guldralog, which means magical meter or meter of spells. It uses the same format, but repeats 1 or both of the full lines in the stanza with a little bit of variation. You see it dotted here and there all over the place. So you'll see a poem will be in Leothatcher, and then there'll be a stanza of Guldralog. It is the principal meter of one of the parts of Havamal where he is actually speaking spells, which is probably why it has this name. That is literally the only place where you'll see a lot of it. Everywhere else, it's really just used for emphasis. So here's my examples. Tell me all this, for all men's faith, I deem that dwarf you know, how wind is called which widest fares, in all the world so wide. So again, we have the vowel alliteration, all vis, all, and then we have the full line, deem, dwarf, and then no is the odd unalliterated syllable. Wind is called which widest fares, in all the world so wide. So Thor speaks about a good 20 of these verses, and each of these verses, only line 3 is the one that's different. How the sky is called, or how, in Old Norse, Segur verthet alvis all of rock vira. So again, we have that vowel alliteration. Vorum dverger ad viter. Vivi. He sa vinder heter vidaster hem herer I. Hemi herer I. Okay. Here's an example in Guldralog. My head lifts up to the lofty gods. Help will come from on high. Gone is my message to many a god that sits in Aegir's seats, that drinks within Aegir's doors. So here we see that repetition. He talks about Aegir's. It sits on Aegir's seats that drinks within Aegir's doors. So that full line is sort of repeated with a difference. All right, those are the Etic meters. Any questions? All right, let's get into the simple one then. This is a meter called Kvuhara. I believe the translation is a little uncertain. Somebody once said meter of discourse. That's what I'm going with. I would refer to this as essentially a skaldic refinement of Fornøyreslag. It is essentially, you take Fornøyreslag and make it much more defined. In this case, and in the case of the other skaldic meter, Drokfate as well, we are counting syllables. We are no longer in this loose format where you can have any number of unstressed syllables between stressed syllables. We are now counting. So there are 3 syllables in the first half line and 4 syllables in the second. So your first half line is super short, and the second is just a little bit longer. It's almost standard, but it's counted. Both half lines have 2 stressed syllables. The second half line falls into the exact same patterns that you saw before. And the alliteration rule is exactly the same as for Fornøyreslag. The first stressed syllable of the second half line alliterates with one or both of the stressed syllables in the first half line. There are 4 line stanzas are typical, but there are exceptions. This form is not end stopped. You can keep going at the end of the line. You don't have to put a pause at the end of each line. In some cases, there'll be a pause even in the middle of a line. That's fine. It is totally fine. And that actually happens in Old English too. So there are not a lot of surviving poems in this meter. I was actually really relieved when I found one that wasn't written by Egil Skallagrimsson, because for a while I was convinced that it was something that he made up because he did that. But Egil's examples are extremely personal. One was regarding the death of his son. The other was a tribute to a close friend. I tend to look at it as more familiar and intimate than Drokfate, but this is sheer speculation on my part, because the other example is a history. Theodulf of Hin's poem it's a history of the Swedish kings. So YMMV. So go to the examples. Long ago, the arm-bearing Swedes reddened their soil with blood of their liege. One sentence, 2.5 lines. Lifeless was sprawled the Maldi. Dew of wombs from his folk hands, harvest eager, spilled his gift to gods above. What's going on there, by the way, is that the Swedes were having a really bad famine for, I believe, 3 years. So they sacrificed their king. The other example I have, which I also have in Old Norse, is Egil Skelograms and Sonotarek, which is a written was written regarding the death of his son who drowned. If my suit with sword could press, I would end the alesmith's days. Could I strike the storm's kinsman, Aegir's might would meet my steel. He's essentially saying that if he could kill the ocean with his sword, he would. Vesd of sok, sverdi rakek, vas orsmith orratima, hroda volbroder, elvida metak, fork agis, andir mani. So we have the S alliteration of the vowel alliteration, that O Kvuhara is alliterates with A. And then we have V alliteration, which I didn't underline. Okay, I'll be sure to get to that. And then another vowel alliteration, despite the fact that they're not exactly the same sound. It's a sort of an it's O and A. Okay. Last but certainly not least is drokvet. Drokvet. Yeah, drokvet. It's been a while since I've re-examined pronouncing these. Drokvet. Which translates to noble warrior's meter. A drot is, honestly, a drot is the closest thing that Old Norse has to a knight, I would say. It generally refers to the warriors who serve the king. This is the primary skaldic meter. The vast majority of surviving skaldic poems are in this verse form. Okay, as I said, occasionally you see a couple of examples, like 3, in Kvuhara, and you see some examples in both Leothatcher and Fornudslag. But most of these are in drokvet. So drokvet is made up of 6-syllable lines. Now these lines are really half lines. I'm kind of breaking the rule that I said before by grouping them into half lines. At 6 syllables, they're more aesthetically pleasing if you arrange them as lines. What would actually be referred to as a line is a quarter stanza, because the stanzas are set length in this. So each line will have, and they will have, 3 stressed and 3 unstressed syllables. Each line ends in a troche, so a stress then an unstressed, but otherwise there is no set pattern to the line. So you can begin with a stress, you can begin with a not stress, but you must end with a stress on the second to last syllable, and you can never end with a stress. And that's honestly an idiosyncrasy of how Norse is constructed. The stress is always on the first syllable in Old Norse. The first stress syllable of the even lines, so the second line in the quarter stanza, is referred to as the main staff, the hovjustav, and will alliterate with 2 of the 3 stress syllables of the prior line. So essentially, remember when I was saying before that Fornudslag is the building blocks which everything else is taken from. It's still the same format. It's just that the 2 stresses have become mandatory. And now it's 3 stresses each line, and now you have to alliterate with 2. You have to alliterate with 2. You don't alliterate with a third. And as far as I know, you never alliterate when it's optional. Or you can alliterate things can alliterate with each other, sort of, but they're not considered important. The main staff alliterates with 2 props. So the main staff of the even line which is the first syllable of the even line, alliterates with 2 of the props of the previous odd line. So, in Old Norse, there's an internal rhyme in both the odd and the even lines. I find this very difficult to do in English, so I don't. It is also acceptable not to do this in Old Norse. It's called formless. Snorri actually says, formless drokvet is when you don't rhyme. So I write in formless. The rules I find it very difficult to do in English, and I find it doesn't really pay off very much because the internal rhyme doesn't ring through as much as an end rhyme, because it's so close to each other. And I will show you in the Old Norse examples. So, but there are rules for this as well. The odd lines, so your first line in the pair has a half rhyme. It's called a skothending, near hit. The last stressed syllable will have the same terminal consonant sound as one of the other syllables. Unlike alliteration, the other rhyme does not need to fall on the stressed syllable. Even lines have a full rhyme. The last stressed syllable will have both of the same vowel sound and the ending consonant sound of one of the other syllables. So it sounds like a rhyme to us. The half rhyme sort of sounds like a rhyme. It's the same vowel sound. Assonance is what we would call it. So 8-line stanzas are typical. There are exceptions, particularly when there are refrains. Lines aren't necessarily end-stopped. The sentence structure tends to be consistent throughout the poem, but it can be a full, half, quarter, or even eighth of a stanza. So that is to say, every half of a line could be its own thing. My examples are end-stopped on the quarter stanza, comparable to a line of another form. So long poems in this form are called dropa, which is a word of uncertain origin. It has a refrain, and usually a quarter stanza that breaks up sections of the poem. So you'll basically have like a one-line refrain that comes in, like, say, 3 or 4 times in the poem to break the poem up into distinct sections. There are at least 20 stanzas in length, a dropa. A shorter poem called a flok, which means a flock, will occasionally have refrain as well. So there are tons of variants on this form, many of them involving the rhymes. It is often thick with kennings and occasionally embeds sentences within other sentences. This is easier to do in Old Norse because of the way the words the way the words give a lot of the context of what they are. So it's hard to do in English. There is a variant involving 8-syllable lines, but it's fairly rare in surviving poems. So you could add an extra, essentially, foot to the line, another stress and unstress. So here are some examples. Nor did haven hinder, Hogni's wrath did grow then, sating there on seashore, snarling grey wolves' hunger. Then did threaten battle fewful hosts of Hogni, reckoned not to enrich with rings of peace she offered. So your first essentially line pair, quarter stanza, we're alliterating on H. Haven hindered Hogni, sating seashore snarling, then threaten fewful, wrecked rich rings. I'm going to go to this example, so I can go to the Old Norse, just in case anybody needs to leave at 8. With your shield find shelter, shining lady told me. Here I cannot hide in hollow of my ship's wall. Well, this gold ring goddess gave me these words also. Hold your head up proud and high when blades are clashing. So remember I was saying before that Harold said that was too poorly composed, let me compose another? This is the other he composed. This is in the Rockfade. It's in a more complex form. In Old Norse, it's Krupen der Vervopna, Voltigs Braken Egi. So we have Vopna, ver Vopna Voltigs as your alliteration. And where's the rhyme? I think it's Krupen ver Vervopna. I'm having trouble finding the half rhyme, but in the second line, it's much easier. Voltigs Braken Egi, Egs Egi. So you see on that one, it actually doesn't fall on the stress. Yeah. Oh, Varen Volp? Yeah, I think maybe. Hold on. Half rhyme. Terminal consonant, but not, yeah, ver. So it's Volp. Yeah, oop and op. There we go. So as I said, I don't do it very often. I'm a little unfamiliar with the rules. Svo bod hild ad hjaldri haldorg I bug skjaldar. So our alliteration is on the H. The ild ald is your half rhyme, and ald is your full rhyme. So it's very similar. Hat bad meg thar matust. Men scored better for them, so we have the M alliteration. And your half rhyme is ought and et, and the full rhyme is orth, again on a non-stress, and forth, scored forth. Hlakar is og hausar, hjalmstoven I ny marma. So HHH again. And then your half rhyme is, is, aus, and your full rhyme is olm, excuse me, it's not olm, because the long A is an aw. All right, last example, the one right above it, another Harold Sigurdsson's poems. On Sicilian seas we sailed in stately fashion, shield-walled moved the shapely ships full manned with warriors. Scarce would cowards care to come, I think, where we did, yet the gold-ring girth from Garthar lets me dangle. Girth is a goddess. As I said before, she's one of the Valkyries. So he's talking about a girth from Garthar. Garthar is Russia. He's talking about the princess of Russia who's putting him off and letting him dangle. All right. Well, that's the class. I can go into some of my sources because that's next. But are there any questions? Come on, somebody's got to have something, right? Well, I mean, almost exactly an hour. Yeah, pronunciation notes. Yeah.
So, any advice for people composing in English?
The biggest one is alliterate with your ear, not with your eye. That is the huge one, and everybody falls into it sooner or later. And always remember I would always sound out the word when you're uncertain of the stress. If you're uncertain of the stress, sound it out in your head. Behold. Okay, it's clearly the second. There are some real weird ones in there. I remember at one point I was trying to alliterate Odin with one, and I'm like, why doesn't this work? Oh, one doesn't actually begin with a vowel; it begins with a W, because it's a homonym of one, WON. So it just Odin's one eye is not alliteration. Well, Odin and I alliterate, but not Odin's one eye. So yeah, that's the big one. The other one, as I said, the rhyme is tough to do in Drottvedt. I don't. Both Magnus and Toki have, so it's possible. It's definitely possible, and I've come close a few times. The weird thing is despite the fact that it's so complicated, it's actually fairly easy to bang out something in Drottvedt fairly quickly. I'm not sure why that is, and the sagas are full of examples of skalds doing just that, just literally just banging out a verse of Drottvedt on the spot because they felt like speaking in verse. So there's that. For Norðurslag is definitely the easiest one to start with. It's also the most versatile, and the skills you get in for Norðurslag would apply to Old English as well. Any other questions? All right, I guess that's everything then. You can see my bibliography here. Out of a number of these, I did mark on a number of these that some of them are available online. Anything with a little circle around it, I found on things like Sacred Text. If you Google them, you should be able to find them. The Skalds is a particularly useful resource. It's a really neat book. It is out of print, but I've never failed to find it on Amazon as a used copy. It's basically it's Liam Hollander going into the lives of a bunch of the Skalds, which is so it's a summary of a lot of sagas, and it's a great way to and he quotes much of the poetry and attempts to repoeticize it in English. So it's a good thing. It's a good starting place for a lot of the particularly the skaldic stuff.
All right, if no one else has any questions, I'm going to say thank you to Master Grimm, and I'm going to stop recording.
Okay, you're very welcome.